Okay. I took a little break, about an hour break. I got some food. I feel refreshed and stuffs. I watched a Vampire Diaries episode where, Mason the Vampire got killed. Spoilers. Uh, Now it's time to read chapter 7 and potentially 8. Yeah, 8 too. Alright, I still can't get this ring light to work, so that's fine. There's a green light and a red light, if you can. Okay, anyway. This chapter is actually entitled. It has a title. It's called, chapter 7, Camp Perry, Virginia. Okie dokie. So is that the name of the camp they are at, or is this a different place? That's what I want to know. Okay, so we're starting. Okay. Different character. Tom Lewis took the call on the secure line. He listened patiently to the person on the other end relay a seemingly benign message about a meeting that was to take place in Washington, D.C. the following afternoon. To anyone with the ability to breach the secure system, which of course included the internal security people back in Langley, the conversation would have seemed so ordinary as to not warrant a second thought. In the third sentence, however, an adverb was used that caused his right eyebrow to shoot up a quarter inch. Lewis thanked the person on the other end and said they would talk at the meeting the next day. Okie dokie, we're not going to get to know what the adverb was. The clinical psychologist slowly placed the phone back in its cradle and tapped his pen on the generic desk blotter. Everything in the office was generic, all standard issue government furniture, the kind that was purchased in massive quantities every year by the behemoth federal government. The desk, bookcase, and credenza were all made from particle board coated with a thin plastic veneer that was supposed to look like wood, but didn't. The chairs were black plastic with coarse charcoal fabric seats that could render a pair of dress pants useless in just 9 months. Lewis was amazed at how ubiquitous, oh my gosh, I can never say this word, ubiquitous this type of furniture had become in Washington, which in turn led him to the conclusion that the maker of this substandard furniture was more than likely headquartered in the home district of the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. Lewis detested such poor craftsmanship, but nonetheless made no attempt to add a personal touch to his office. His private office was in the district, and every square inch of it had been meticulously decorated. With what he had charged for an hour of therapy, he could not only afford the fine trappings, but even more. His clients expected it. In a rather short period of time, he had built up a very profitable practice. His patient list was a virtual who's who of Washington's power elite. Lobbyists, lawyers, and CEOs made up the bulk of his business. He treated only a smattering of politicians, but dozens of women who were married to powerful senators and congressmen came to see him every week and poured their hearts and minds out. If he were unscrupulous, he'd be able to use that information to his benefit, but he had never been tempted. The 36-year-old Lewis had both the passion and the natural inclination for his work. He had obtained an undergraduate degree in economics and math from Pomona College and a graduate degree in clinical psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. The latter was paid for by the government, which required him to serve 4 years in the Army upon graduating. That stint in the Army, more than anything, was what pulled Lewis into this current situation, in a windowless, crappy office on a base that very few people even knew existed. It seemed he had a knack for spotting mental deficiencies, which when he was in the Army was something that greatly interested at least one flag officer and a couple of colonels down at Fort Bragg. He'd spent 3 years helping the Joint Special Operations Command tighten up their selection process and develop a new system for game theory. That's just a thing. Okay, I'm sorry. Lewis took a moment to collect his thoughts and figure out how the call would affect his evening. The camp had a bachelor's quarters of sorts for the various employees and consultants who traveled back and forth to D.C. When a new class was on the post, he normally stayed 1 or 2 nights a week, so he could observe how they interacted. He had planned on staying the evening and spending some time with one of the recruits who was showing some troublesome signs. But the phone call was more pressing. Lewis looked down at the World War II Elgin A11 U.S. military watch. That is a mouthful and a half. Watch. His father had given it to him on his deathbed 3 years earlier. Okay. Lewis had replaced the worn strap and kept the watch in near perfect shape. It was 7:14 in the evening. Nothing on his desk was that urgent, and besides, it was a perfect evening to get out on the open road and clear his mind. He collected the 2 open files and spun his chair around to face a gray metal safe, which was already open. Lewis placed the files in the paper slot, closed the safe, and spun the dial. He left the office door open, as there was nothing other than the contents of the safe that needed to be protected. His motorcycle was parked in the first space in front of the building. Lewis took off his sport coat and tie and carefully folded and placed them on the seat. He unlocked one of the saddlebags of the B&W 1200 motorcycle and retrieved a gray and black leather riding jacket and a pair of chaps. He never rode his bike without them. Even with the thermometer pushing 90 degrees, imprinted on his brain was the road rash a friend had received when he'd been forced to lay his bike down on a hot California afternoon. The jacket and tie were placed in the saddlebag, and he put on his gray helmet. The motorcycle hummed to life, and Lewis climbed on. 60 seconds later, he tipped his visor at the sentry standing post at the main gate and blew past him. A minute after that, he was rocketing up the entrance ramp onto Interstate 64 and on his way north. The drive would take a bit more than an hour, which Lewis didn't mind in the least. No phones, no one knocking on his door wanting him to listen to his problems. Lewis was finding it increasingly difficult to find the time to clear his mind and focus on the task at hand. A big green sign informed him how many miles he had to travel to reach Richmond, but he barely noticed. He was already thinking of their new recruit. That had to be why she had called. Lewis set the cruise control at 70 miles per hour, adjusted himself on the seat, and checked his mirrors. He considered how much work he had put into this one candidate. The man was as close to perfect as anyone who had come across in the almost 2 years he'd been working on the program. Lewis leaned into a turn and wondered if it was possible for Hurley to run the kid out in one afternoon. Unfortunately, he knew the answer to that question because he'd seen him do it on more than one occasion. Okay, so they alluded to it in the last chapter. I didn't say anything in that previous video, but obviously this isn't an operation that is secret at all, because this guy is just not normal, but he's a psychologist, and he's in on it. And he's on his way to go do more work. What work is that? I'm really intrigued on how this guy plays into the story. I wanted to say also that Victor from the last chapter, I don't like him. But also, I'm not sure I like the way Mitch was talking. I'm not sure I like it. I wish maybe it'll grow on me later, I'm sure. But Mitch is a person that I like, obviously, because he's the main character. But I didn't like the way he was talking to Victor. There's that. Can you guys hear the wind outside? The wind whistling through that window? Because it's very distracting. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and get into the next chapter. This one is also titled Lake Anna, but it's called Lake Anna, Virginia. So we're going back to Lake Anna. Right? Or is it a different... No, we've never been there. Is this a different place? So many places in Virginia. Ugh. Okay. So this next chapter, chapter 8, Lake Virginia. This should fit nicely into this. And then I really need to get to sleep because it is noon. And I've been up since 1:30 a.m. But I need to get my sleep schedule back on track because I work nights, and if I'm sleeping until 1:30 in the morning, that's not good. Anyway, this chapter 8, Lake Anna, Virginia. It was a moonless night sky, and all but a few of the exterior lights were off, so as not to attract bugs. The Mutts had just finished their run, and another 100 up-downs, and a few more exercises designed to fatigue little-used muscles, and maybe get one or more of them to quit so they could get down to the serious stuff. Unfortunately, all 7 were now filing into the barn in a manner not much different than that of cows returning from a day grazing in the pasture. Their heads were down, their pace was slow, and their footing unsure, and fortunately, the arguing was over. The only thing they could think about at the moment was sleep. Hurley took a sip of bourbon and looked out across the lawn. Despite the fact that it was his 7th in the past 3 hours, he was not drunk. When it came to booze and a lot of other things, the spook had the constitution of a man 3 times his size. Tonight, however, his normally unshakable confidence was a little wobbly. Hurley was feeling a nagging indecision that to the average person was a daily occurrence, but to a headstrong, decisive man like him was rare. The shiner on his eye and his throbbing headache were nothing more than a nagging physical symptom. A few more glasses of Maker's Mark, and they would be thoroughly dulled. The problem was between his ears, a crack in his psyche that had put him in a rarely visited but increasingly familiar place. It was gnawing at the back of his head, trying to crawl into his brainstem and take him down. The signs were all there: tight chest, quick breath, a sudden desire to get the hell out of Dodge and go somewhere, anywhere but here. For a man who was used to being in control, used to being right all the time, it was the most unwelcome feeling he could imagine. He'd rather get kicked in the head until he was knocked unconscious than try to wrestle with this crap. The fix, Hurley knew, involved something he still wasn't used to. He'd spent years burying his problems, patching them, hiding them under anything he could find. His job was too important. There were too many enemies to confront, and not enough men willing to do it. There was too much to do. The stakes were too high for him to sit around and feel sorry for himself. He was, after all, a product of the Cold War. While the children of the 60s cut loose and got in touch, Hurley cut throats and got as out of touch with his feelings as was possible. He darted around Europe in the late 50s and early 60s, and then Southeast Asia in the mid-60s. The 70s brought him to South America, the early 80s to Central America, and then finally, for the biggest shit show of all, he landed in the Middle East. The entire thing was a gigantic multi-dimensional chess match with the Soviets. A continuation of what had happened at the end of World War I, and then the aftermath of World War II. Getting in touch with his thoughts or feelings, or whatever they were, was not something Hurley relished. There was right and there was wrong, and in between an abyss filled with society's whiners, people who had inherited their luxury of safety and freedom, while having done nothing to earn it. He had never heard these opinions pass the lips of his mother or father. They didn't have to. He was born during the Depression, but they had lived through it. They moved from Chicago to Bowling Green, Kentucky, with their 5 kids to escape the long food lines and massive unemployment of the inner city. Hurley had come of age not knowing any better. His lot in life seemed just as good as the next kid's. He'd taken that stoic demeanor and joined the army. After serving his stint, he enrolled at Virginia Tech on the GI Bill and graduated with decent marks. That final spring, a man from the federal government, who was extremely interested in his military record, asked him if he'd like to see the world. Asked him if he'd like to make a difference. Hurley bit. Officially, he'd spent the last 21 years darting in and out of war-torn countries and doing his part to create a few wars, too. Unofficially, it had been longer than that. He'd been on the very edge of the conflict between the Soviets and America and had no illusions about which side was the more noble of the two. All a person had to do was spend a little time in Berlin to understand the effects of communism and capitalism. Talk about a tale of two cities. East Berlin and West Berlin were living, breathing examples. Posters for the government who had run them since the end of World War II. One side was a vivid Kodachrome film, and the other a grainy old black and white pile of crap. Hurley had never been more proud than when that damn wall came tumbling down. He'd spilled his own blood in the battle. He'd spilled his own blood in the battle and had lost a few friends, and more sources than he could count or wanted to remember, but they'd won. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of time to enjoy their victory. Hurley and a few others already had their eyes on the jihadists. I swear I'm saying this wrong. Jihadists? He'd come across them when he was helping bleed the Soviet Union of cash, equipment, manpower, and eventually the will to continue its despotic experiment. It had been in the Khyber Pass, and at first he saw nothing that made him nervous. These people wanted their land back and the Soviets out. The problem started with the religious zealots who were being shipped in from Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and a handful of other crappy little countries. Saudi Arabia is not crappy. I'm kidding. I don't know anything about Saudi Arabia. For all I know, it is. Who knows? I bet it's a lovely country. This next... Okay, I'm sorry. Hurley loved to swear, drink, and chase women, which put him on a collision course with the Puritan fun-sucking Wahhabi jihadists from Saudi Arabia. Well, that's why they don't like Saudi Arabia, I see now. He almost instantly developed a special dislike for them, but didn't understand back then that they would want to spread their jihad beyond the Jerkwater Mountains of Southwest Asia. That came later. Then he started to see them meddling in the affairs of the Palestinians. It was starting all over again. The Soviets had been contained and beaten, and now this new enemy was out pushing its agenda. Hurley had a bad feeling about where it was headed, and on top of that, for the first time in his life, he felt tired. This threat was not going away, and he suddenly wasn't sure he could find, let alone train, the next batch of kids who would be needed to meet the threat. He needed help. Unfortunately, asking for help was not something Hurley was good at. He heard one of the dogs bark, and then the sound of a motorcycle drifting through the pines. It was not the rumble of an American-made motorcycle, rather the purr of a Japanese or a German bike. Hurley breathed a small sigh that was part relief, part resignation. It was the doc. He realized Kennedy must have called him. Yes. A single beam of light slashed through the trees, and a moment later the motorcycle coasted around the corner. The bike was so quiet, Hurley could hear the tires on the gravel driveway. The bike rolled its way up to the house, and the rider eased the kickstand into the down position, and then killed the engine. Sorry. After retrieving a flat piece of wood from one of the molded saddlebags, he put it under the kickstand and then took off his helmet. Thomas Lewis ran a hand through his shaggy blonde hair and looked up at Hurley. He immediately noticed the swelling over the eye, but he was more concerned with the look on the man's face that he had only recently grown to understand. Tough day? Hurley tried to laugh it off. No easy days in this line of work, you know that. Lewis nodded. He knew all too well the toll that their business could inflict on a person, and not just the body. The physical injuries were fairly straightforward. They could either be mended or not. The assaults on the mind and soul were an entirely different matter. Okay, I just realized who this guy was. This is Kennedy's boss. I don't know why I thought he was a new person. Sorry. Number one. I mixed up names. But that's fine, right? Yeah, nobody saw anything. This isn't being recorded. And besides, they called him... Okay, they called him Tom Lewis. My brother's name is Thomas, and we never, ever call him Tom. And my parents basically forbid us to call him Tommy. Otherwise, I would have. Actually, I did. I called him Tommy Boy most of the time, and she's like, stop calling him Tommy Boy. I'm like, but it's cute. And she's like, no! So I'm like, fine, Thomas. But yeah, that's why I mixed it up. Just so you know. And plus, the chapter kept calling him Lewis, and I'm just, yeah. Anyway, this is interesting because it gives us a little more backstory on Hurley and where he went. He basically was in the army his whole life. That's basically what it's saying. Or involved in the army. I want to get back to Mitch, please. Actually, I want to know more about Mitch's backstory. We probably won't learn about it till later. But yeah. Anyway, I think that's enough for today. I need to go to sleep. Otherwise my friends will kill me if I don't get on Minecraft later with them. They're starting a new mod pack called Horrorcraft, and they were mad that I wasn't there last night. I slept all day. Actually, I went to bed at 4 p.m. yesterday, so that's why I woke up so early/late. But otherwise, I would read more of this. I want to know more. I'm looking at this next chapter just barely, and I'm seeing a lot of words that I don't know, so I'm just gonna put this away. There's a lot of words that I don't know in this book, and I love it because I love learning new words. Anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and end this, and I'm gonna start uploading. Just so you guys know, you probably already noticed, but I don't really edit these down. They just kind of go up raw because it's a book reading and I'm giving my thoughts afterwards. So what would I cut out? My thoughts? That's not what the point is. So yeah. See you guys in the next one, which will probably be tomorrow. Well, I'll start reading again tomorrow, on the 28th. But it's the 27th now. So this will take a few days to upload all of these. But just so you know, I will be reading more tomorrow. If that makes any sense whatsoever. Yeah, that's all I want to say. Bye.